The last radar return was at about 11,000 feet, and the evidence we have at this point is that the aircraft broke up in flight. The outboard section of the right wing, the the horizontal stabilizer and elevator also departed the aircraft.
That's the voice of NTSB Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg speaking at an NTSB press conference about the tragic crash of a Pilatus PC-12 in Nevada. And today we'll answer the question, what happened just before this aircraft broke up in flight? Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we'll be talking about what led up to the crash of a Medevac PC-12 a few days ago. Last week in episode 265, we talked about precipitation static or P-static, how it occurs and what you can do about it. And we also had a Friday mailbag episode, episode 266, in which we read your letters and feedback, including what it would take to transition a pilot trained in a Diamond DA-42 into a traditional piston twin, and about a fatal DA-42 spin accident in Norway. So if you didn't hear those episodes, you may want to check them out at aviationnewstalk.com/265 and 266. And this is a listener-supported show, and we're still ad-free. So if you've ever learned anything from Aviation News Talk, please just take the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to become a member and join the club to support Aviation News Talk. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, I've included a link for that website in our show notes. And if my voice sounds slightly different, it's because I'm recording this show from my hotel room in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I've been for the past 3 days. I flew here Friday in a Vision jet with its owner, and I'll be returning to California on Tuesday, and I'll tell you more about that trip in episode 268. Now, the last few days have been bad for general aviation safety, and we'll talk about one of those accidents in detail. On Wednesday of last week, a King Air crashed shortly after taking off from Little Rock, Arkansas, killing all on board. The aircraft was owned and operated by Little Rock-based environmental consulting firm CTEH. The pilot and 4 passengers on board were all CTEH employees, reportedly traveling to Ohio, responding to a fatal explosion at a metal factory. Storms were reported in the area. On Friday, there were 2 crashes. As I was flying the Vision jet to Knoxville, David Rathbun, age 52, the chief engineer for the Cirrus SF-50 jet program, was taking off from Duluth International Airport in Minnesota in a 2016 Cirrus SR20. He reached an altitude of about 2,300 feet AGL when apparently the aircraft had an engine failure. He appears to have been gliding to the Superior, Wisconsin airport straight ahead when his descent rate increased and he crashed into Lake Superior. The aircraft landed on the ice and then broke through the ice, and David was killed. I didn't know him, but friends of mine at Cirrus did, and this is a tremendous loss to them and the company. David started at Cirrus in 1996, which was 3 years before the company released its first plane, the SR20, in 1999. It's entirely possible that he initially had a partial power loss and he thought that he could make it to the Superior Airport. The increase in his descent rate suggests that perhaps at the end, partial power loss became a complete engine failure. Unfortunately, the cap's parachute was not pulled, as it might have led to a different outcome. Then on Friday night, a Pilatus PC-12 took off from Reno, Nevada airport at about 9 p.m. at night and crashed 16 minutes later, killing the pilot and 4 others on board. The weather at the time was 1 3/4 mile visibility and overcast at 1,700 feet, and it was snowing lightly at the time. I'm going to first play for you the ATC communications for that flight, and then I'll play audio from the NTSB press conference that was held on Sunday night. Later, I'll provide you with some additional information on what happened immediately preceding the crash. As you'll hear from the first transmissions, the single pilot on board had some difficulty identifying the ramp and taxiway, most likely because it was dark and possibly because snow was obscuring many of the markings on the tarmac. Here are those transmissions.
Reno ground, good evening. Medevac 273 Sierra Mike, IFR to Salt Lake City. We have echo.
Medevac 273 Sierra Mike, Reno clearance delivery cleared to Salt Lake City Airport. Zephyr 7 departure, Blackjack transition, then is filed. Climb via SID, squawk 3211.
Okay, clear to Salt Lake City via the Zephyr 7 Blackjack transition. Via the SID 3211 for Medevac 30 Mike.
Medevac 30 Mike, read back correct.
And Reno ground, Medevac 2730 Mike is ready to taxi from Atlantic with Echo.
Medevac 2730 Mike, Reno ground, runway 17 left, taxi via Charlie.
17 left via Charlie for Medevac 30 Mike.
Medevac 30 Mike, do you need help finding the exit?
Yeah, it's going to be the left of me here, right?
Affirmative, it's left of you about 3 plane lengths. You can see the brake and the blue light.
Got it there, thank you so much.
Medevac 30 Mike, use caution as you go. It hasn't been flat in a while.
Copy.
Right turn now, you're past the center line of the taxiway. I think you've gone too far at this point.
Talking.
Medevac 30 Mike, I think you've passed the center line of the taxiway. You'd have to make a hard right turn to get on Charlie.
Okay, roger that. We're gonna take a left here and then come back around.
Roger. Aircraft formation, Foxtrot, current altimeter 2982.
Medevac 2730 Mike, Reno Tower, advise ready.
Yeah, we're ready to roll. Medevac 30 Mike.
Medevac 30 Mike, wind 330 at 5, runway 17 left, cleared for takeoff.
17 left, cleared for takeoff. Medevac 30 Mike.
Medevac 30 Mike, contact NorCal departure. See you later.
Departure, we'll see you later. Thanks for your help. 30 Mike. NorCal departure, good evening. Medevac 2730 Mike is with you, climbing via the SID. Medevac 2730 Mike, NorCal departure, Reno Cafe. Medevac 2730 Mike, coming Dothan Center, 128.8. All right, 28.8 for 30 Mike, good night. Open Center, good evening. Medevac 2730 Mike, 15.4, climbing via the SID.
Medevac 2730 Mike, Oakland Center, good evening. Climb and maintain level 250 and use caution. There's been a light to moderate chop and also some moderate turbulence reported pretty much all afternoon, really most altitudes. So I think for time being, 270 and below have been the best rides going to the northeast. Just let me know if you need to try something different.
Okay, copy that. Thank you for 30 Mike, and we're going up to flight level 250.
And Medevac 30 Mike, Oakland.
And that was followed by numerous similar transmissions from Oakland Center trying to reach the downed aircraft. And now here's audio from NTSB Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg speaking at the NTSB press conference that was held on Sunday night.
We're here, obviously, to investigate the Guardian Medevac flight that crashed Friday evening, February 24th, this last Friday. First off, I want to offer, on behalf of the entire NTSB, our condolences to the family and of the flight crew and the patients on board. It was a real tragedy, and our thoughts go out to them. I'd also like to thank the first responders who helped us with this, including the Lyon County Sheriff and the Lyon County Central Fire District. So we're here to give a preliminary assessment, and the details of what we provide to you here may change. This is what we know at this point. The crash occurred at about 9:14 Pacific Standard Time near Dayton, Nevada. 5 people on board, a pilot, a flight nurse, a patient, a paramedic, and a family member. Tragically, there were no survivors. Flight was operated by Guardian Flight based in South Jordan, Utah, which I understand is close to Salt Lake City, under Federal Air Regulation Part 135, which means that they are operating for hire. They have a fleet of over 60 aircraft that they operate in various locations around the country. This will be the 4th event that the NTSB has investigated with Guardian Flight. Over the last several years, they had a fatal accident here that is still an investigation, a King Air that was lost in Hawaii, 3 fatalities. That is still in process. Another King Air in Alaska, also 3 fatalities. The cause of that is undetermined. And a incident in Arizona involving a loss of control. There were no injuries and no fatalities and no damage to the aircraft. The aircraft itself was a Pilatus PC-12. It's a single-engine, fixed-wing turboprop. They departed Reno at approximately 9 o'clock, headed for Salt Lake City on an instrument flight rules flight plan. They were airborne for about 14 minutes. Normal air traffic control communications, they were cleared to flight level 250 or 25,000 feet. The highest the flight attained was just over 19,000 feet when radar noticed that the aircraft was in a descending right turn at a high rate of descent. The last radar return was at about 11,000 feet, and the evidence we have at this point is that the aircraft broke up in flight. The outboard section of the right wing, the the horizontal stabilizer and elevator also departed the aircraft. We have recovered those pieces. They were about a half to 3/4 of a mile from the runway. The aircraft, the flight wreckage, the aircraft did not have any flight data recorders on it or cockpit voice recorders, nor was it required to. This is something that the NTSB would like to see the FAA require on these airplanes. We have an investigative team of approximately 11 people now that are here from literally all over the country. They will be here for several days and gathering perishable evidence. We have a team out there on the field right now that is combing the area for parts of the aircraft. We'll be looking at the engines, any recording devices outside of the approved recorders that it did not have on board. The avionics equipment on the aircraft sometimes will have data on board that we can download the information from. We'll be looking at the pilot, the aircraft itself, whatever maintenance records there were, the fuel on the aircraft, the weather conditions. Icing was reported and moderate turbulence in the area, so that will be an area of interest for us. The company's dispatch procedures and their general policies. The team members we have here are structures, avionics, systems, operations, meteorology, human factors. Our transportation disaster assistance people are here also to help with the families and air traffic control people. Preliminary report should be out in about 2 weeks. And at that point, we'll be able to add a little bit more to what we know. We won't have a probable cause, though, and final report until probably 12 to 18 months after the crash, as long as it takes for us to get to the bottom of this. For media updates, that would be Twitter at NTSB_newsroom. And if there are any witness out there that have any information for us, witness at ntsb.gov. So that's what we know at this point. Obviously, there's a lot more to learn. So I will take your questions. If you would, please raise your hand. And when I call on you, state your name and your affiliation. Yes, sir.
Bert Johnson with KUNR Public Radio. I'm curious, first of all, do you know at this point where the flight was departing from, which airfield it left from?
Yes, where was the flight departing from? It departed from Reno International Airport, and it was bound for Salt Lake City. It was on an instrument flight rule flight plan. The radar track and all of the radio communications with air traffic control were absolutely normal. There was no distress call at any point from the aircraft saying they had any kind of difficulty whatsoever.
Is the weather the main factor, do you think?
That's one of the, is the weather the main factor? That's one of the things we'll be looking at. I think it's too soon at this point to rule anything in or anything out. There are any number of possibilities on this, but weather will get a very close scrutiny. I can assure you. They reported moderate turbulence and icing conditions. These airplanes are designed to fly in that type of weather condition, but obviously there could be something, and we'll be looking at both the big picture. We'll be getting pilot reports from air traffic control, anything that anybody had on the air traffic system that will provide that. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Amy. I'm from the Reno Gazette-Journal. Did I hear you correctly that you said the pieces broke up in the air?
That is correct. The question...
What caused something like that from your past knowledge?
Okay, so the question was, did the aircraft break up in the air and what would cause that? So, yes, the aircraft did break up prior to ground contact. We don't know exactly what altitude at which that occurred. That's one of the things that we'll be looking at. There are any number of possibilities as to why an aircraft could break up, and it'll be something that we'll be looking at. Overstress is one of the things. The aircraft could encounter turbulence. We don't know that yet. Fatigue, possibly, on the part of the aircraft. Again, this is a little bit unusual. Airplanes are well built and well maintained. Corrosion, stress factors, all of those things. You bring up a good point, however. Once we have gathered all of the perishable evidence that's here, the wreckage will be moved to a secured facility in Phoenix, where our people will go through it in great detail. And they will be looking very closely at the wreckage signature and the parts of the aircraft. And when they find the right parts and pieces, those will probably be shipped to our metallurgical laboratory at NTSB headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they have an electron scanning microscope. And they will go through this thing absolutely to determine exactly what happened, and we'll have a pretty good idea then of why, but right now we just don't know. Yes, sir.
Jason, also from the Reno Gazette-Journal. How are you already able to determine that the plane was breaking up before it hit the ground or crashed? If there's an easy way to explain that.
Good question of how do we know that the aircraft broke up in flight? Very simply, if the airplane is intact at the main wreckage location, then you know that it was all together when it came there. This was not the case here. As I said, we found parts of the aircraft about half to 3/4 of a mile away, and we've had a team out there pretty much all day combing the area to make sure that we get all of the pieces, because that will help us to understand exactly what transpired. Yes, ma'am.
Kelsey with Carson now. So you said that this is the fourth such instance of these crafts going down. Has there been a determined cause for the prior three of why they went down?
Okay, so the question is, this is the fourth incident involving Guardian flight. To my knowledge, we do not have much detail on the prior ones. The one in Hawaii, which I just mentioned, that aircraft went into the ocean. They did recover it. That is still in process. The aircraft in Canada, that unfortunately remains undetermined. We were unable to determine why that aircraft crashed. The incident that involved a loss of control involved a autopilot malfunction, I believe, and a pilot overreaction. So those are all on our website, and you could take a look. So
I'm sorry, one follow-up question. So does NTSB look into maintenance logs of Guardian flight for these crashes to see that the crafts were being maintained properly?
The question is, does NTSB look into the maintenance logs on any event that we investigate? And the answer is absolutely yes. We look at all of those things because we need to determine, was there something in the maintenance that caused the aircraft to malfunction, and then the pilot was unable to cope with it. We'll also be looking at the pilot's training records, and all of those things. So we go through every possible conceivable way that this could occur. So that helps us to understand what happened, the why it happened, and then if there's something that we can learn from this to help us make recommendations to the FAA, to the operators, and others to prevent it from happening again.
The press conference continued for another 9 minutes, and I'm not including it as it didn't add much to our knowledge about the crash. Let's talk in more detail about the flight. The aircraft was climbing via the Zephyr 7 SID, or Standard Instrument Departure Procedure, with a blackjack transition. It took off from runway 17 left. The takeoff minimums for the Zephyr 7 from runway 17 left are 700 feet overcast and 1 1/8 mile visibility. The clouds were about 1,000 feet higher than required, and the visibility was 5/8 of a mile better than required. The departure has a non-standard minimum climb rate of 440 feet per nautical mile to 9,400 feet, and then a 400 feet per nautical mile climb rate to 13,000 feet. That's about double the standard climb rate, though well within the capabilities of a Pilatus PC-12. The departure off runway 17 left requires a pilot to climb on a heading of 167 degrees, which is essentially the runway heading, to 4,920 feet, about 500 feet above the Reno field elevation, and then fly direct to Zephyr, which is straight ahead. The next segment is also straight ahead for 7 miles to the EPOS intersection. At EPOS, aircraft make about a 60-degree left turn and fly 6 miles to the WIT intersection. At WIT, they turn left about 60 degrees again and fly 9 miles to the DAT intersection, which they are required to cross at a minimum of 14,000 feet. At DAT, aircraft are to make a 12-degree turn to the left and then fly 12 miles to the Blackjack fix, which is the end of the departure procedure. I've looked at the ADSB data for the flight on adsbexchange.com, and the flight looks normal until the aircraft reaches the DAT intersection, the last fix prior to Blackjack, where the procedure terminates. The aircraft had a ground speed of about 120 to 130 knots throughout the climb to the south and the southeast, all the way to the WIT intersection. After the turn at WIT to the northeast, the aircraft climbed steadily at about 160 knots, possibly because of increased tailwinds in that direction. The ground track is extremely straight along all of these segments, consistent with an autopilot being on, something you would expect from a pilot flying night IFR in the mountains, in weather, in a highly capable aircraft. But just as the aircraft reached the DAT intersection, where it should have turned 12 degrees to the left to fly to Blackjack, the aircraft made a 90-degree turn to the right instead of a 12-degree turn to the left. After completing the 90-degree turn to the right, the aircraft then turned back about 90 degrees to the left to the approximate heading it was on during the prior segment of the approach. From the time the first wrong turn to the right occurred, the airspeed and altitude change became a little bit more erratic, suggesting that the pilot began hand-flying the aircraft at about the time the wrong turn began. For example, immediately before the turn, the aircraft had been steadily climbing at around 160 knots. But as the turn started, the aircraft slowed to 147, then 115 knots before accelerating to 138 knots and then back to 194 knots, all within about 80 seconds. At the same time, the altitude went from 18,300 feet to 18,700, then 19,100, back down to 19,000 feet, and then up to 19,400 feet. For the next 15 seconds, the aircraft flew a fairly steady track to the northeast while going slightly up and down at around 200 knots. It then started a steep turn to the right, making a complete 360-degree turn in 27 seconds. And in that 27 seconds, it also lost 6,300 feet, losing about half of that altitude in the last 7 seconds. The turn radius for the first half of the turn was relatively constant, as was the airspeed at around 190 knots, which makes it possible to estimate the bank angle during the turn. The diameter of the turn at the halfway point was about 3,040 feet, so the turn radius was around 1,520 feet. Using a bank angle calculator, I determined that the aircraft was in about a 65-degree bank turn for the first half of the turn. The turn radius was even smaller for the second half of the turn, suggesting that the bank angle was even greater. It's in the second half of the turn that the aircraft likely exceeded its design limits and lost the outboard portion of the right wing and the top of the T-tail, which includes the horizontal stabilizer in the elevator. Looking at the data, it appears clear that the autopilot was disconnected somewhere close to the DAT intersection, but the big question that might never be answered is why the autopilot became disconnected. There are at least several possible reasons. One is that the pilot accidentally disconnected it himself. That happened to me a few days ago as I was flying the Vision Jet here to Knoxville. It was nighttime when it occurred and very dark in the cockpit. As I moved my right hand, it brushed against the top of the autopilot disconnect button at the top of the right side stick, and I heard the autopilot disconnect tones. It's happened to me before in the Vision Jet, so I try to be careful when moving my right hand. When it happened, I reached over the autopilot control panel and turned it back on, probably within 3 to 4 seconds of disconnecting it. Now, I haven't flown the Pilatus PC-12, so I don't know how easy it is to accidentally disconnect the autopilot or how likely this is to occur in that aircraft. As Bruce Landsberg mentioned, autopilots can disconnect for other reasons, such as when encountering turbulence. That being said, I've encountered severe turbulence in a Cirrus SR20, and that autopilot continued to operate normally. However, the Pilatus PC-12 uses a different autopilot, and I have no idea how susceptible to turbulence it may or may not be. It's also possible for an autopilot to disconnect if a pilot is accidentally pushing or pulling on the yoke while the autopilot is engaged. Now, this is a particularly insidious disconnection, as it can occur with relatively low pressure on the yoke, and a pilot might not even be aware that he or she was leaning on the yoke. In most autopilots, if a pilot applies pressure to the yoke while the autopilot is engaged, the trim wheel will start running continuously until it hits the stop. If the autopilot then disengages, the aircraft will either pitch up or down sharply, and the pilot will then have to use many pounds of force to manhandle the now badly mistrimmed aircraft. Another possibility, though I think it's unlikely, is that the flight management system was misprogrammed, and as it reached the data intersection, it turned in the wrong direction, and the pilot disconnected the autopilot, turned the aircraft back on course. In most FMS systems I've used, when loading a departure procedure, all of the waypoints are loaded, so it's unlikely that the wrong fix was entered after DAT, as the system would have loaded Jackpot, which was the last fix, which the aircraft did not fly toward. However, it's conceivable that the pilot accidentally deleted Jackpot, and at DAT he noted that the aircraft was flying in the wrong direction and began hand-flying the aircraft. A flight plan error like that might be hard to determine unless the NTSB is able to find evidence of the original flight plan that was in use when they analyze the remaining avionics. Now, regardless of the exact cause of this accident, it underscores the need for pilots to stay proficient in hand-flying an aircraft, something the FAA recently stated. And in an opinion piece written last month in the Seattle Times, aviation journalist Andy Pastores wrote regarding the FAA that agency officials say excessive dependence on autopilots, autothrottles, and other computerized safeguards has potentially deadly downsides. Complacency can hinder startled pilots from dealing with cascading problems. In its strongest statement yet on the topic, the FAA urged pilots in coming years to sometimes hand-fly entire departure and arrival routes or potentially the entire flight. Such practices are supported by years of FAA research and congressional directives. However, they are generally shunned by airline managements focused on utilizing automation to improve fuel economy and maximize smooth rides for passengers. Thanks so much for listening. If you have feedback or insights about this accident you'd like to share, go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and send me an email, and I'll read some of your emails on a future show. And this, of course, is a listener-supported show, so we always look for your feedback and suggestions for future shows. Also, you can help us grow the show by forwarding this episode to one or two friends who you feel might benefit from it, and then encourage them to click on the follow or the subscribe button in their app so that they'll get new episodes as we release them each week. And I also want to invite you to become a member and join the club to support Aviation News Talk. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and choose the dollar amount you'd like to pledge to support the show. And at the same time, you can read about the things you get at different dollar levels. Or you can make a one-time donation at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Thanks to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until you're silent, baby, sliding upside down.